Hello everyone, this is Professor Hasselman, and today we're going to be talking about civilizations and the Americas and in Africa. And one of the terms, just to kind of clarify, that we're going to be using today is this term post-classical, which deals with a little more time, a little bit before the time this course specifically deals with. The post-classical period we usually refer to as the medieval period in European history, but we don't like to really use this term in terms of global history because it's unfair to just use the term in place of as a European term, Eurocentric term, because not every part of the world had this Dark Ages Renaissance or Roman Empire Renaissance, and then this Dark Ages or medieval period in between. So we call it this post-classical period because it fits in with the more global schema. Now the problem is that it doesn't always fit into every civilization. Now in other world civilization classes and earlier ones, you may talk about Asia and Australasia and parts of Europe and India. But the problem is that there are other parts of the world, specifically the Americas and Africa, that tend to have a little bit different way of defining these terms. Now, that's not to say that history didn't happen in these places. Now, important developments did occur in the Americas and Africa during this post-classical period. And of course, they abundantly illustrate the theme of the expanding geography of civilization as a form of human organization. Now, the Americas offer a particular challenge because of the lack of connection to the rest of the world. One scholar, annoyed with at the problems world historians have with pre-Columbian America, has written a book, in fact, called 1491, this one right here, Revelations of America Before Columbus. And the facts remain, however, that vital American developments do not cleanly fit the larger patterns of the period. And that because of later devastation, the heritage of the Americas for subsequent history was limited as well. Now, Africa is a different case, now complicated mainly by a long tradition of historical neglect. African kingdoms and trading patterns in the post-classical period were deeply connected to the larger world network of the time. Now, differences from the Americas are thus clear. The really interesting comparisons involved such places as Western Europe. So in this lecture, we're going to be looking at the Americas prior to the arrival of Columbus, and Africa as well. And we're going to be looking at how they either compare or contrast with other civilizations in this post-classical period. Now, one of the things to think about as you're watching this lecture, is to think about the issue of what is history. So the question we're asking is, what is history? Now, typically when we answer this question, history is the study of things that have been written down. And the problem is, in some of these early civilizations, especially the Americas and Africa, there isn't a lot of written history. So it becomes very difficult for us to kind of ask ourselves, when does the history in these places begin? Now, one of the remaining puzzle pieces to fit together for the post-classical period involves the civilizations, like I said, in the Americas and Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, in this lecture, we'll talk about how we can use these two cases to illustrate some of the key themes of the post-classical period, and more specifically, the world history prior to 1450. Now, civilizations in the Americas began before the post-classical period. And typically when we refer to this post-classical period, we refer to about 600 BCE to about 600 CE. Okay, so that's from 600 to 600. Okay, so as we'll note today, some of these civilizations, especially in the Americas, don't fit into this global time frame. Now, because the Americas were not directly connected to Asia, Europe, or Africa, the periodization of the post-classical period is somewhat artificially imposed on the Americas. Now, early civilizations emerged in Central America, and suggestions of early civilization are found a bit later in the Andes. Now, the post-classical period itself captured the final flowering of Mayan civilization in Central America, the later decline of the Mayans, and the emergence of a mixed Mayan-Toltec civilization or society in parts of Central America. Now, also in Central America, the Aztec Empire arose in the mid 14th century. Now, the Aztecs were immigrants from the north into central Mexico and other parts of Central America, and the Aztec Empire would flourish during much of the 15th century. Now, the post-classical period captures the development of further civilization activities in the Andes, particularly the emergence of the Inca Empire from about 1400 onward. Now, stretching over a very long swath of territory along the Pacific coast of what is now Latin America. Now, developments in American civilization in the post-classical period emphasize continued improvements in agriculture. Now, American societies were based on the cultivation of several key crops, including corn and potatoes. The emphasis on agriculture and the careful organization of cultivation produced amazing population concentrations and impressive cities by the 14th and 15th centuries. Now, trading activities were also extensive, with networks running throughout Central America. Now, interesting cultural forms arose in the American civilizations, seen in artistic representations of fierce gods and goddesses, as well as impressive scientific developments. Now, the post-classical period also saw a territorial expansion of American civilizations and a flowering of cultural and economic developments. Now, scholars debate the question of how to place American patterns into a larger world framework in this pre-Columbian post-classical age. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Charles Mann, who recently published his work 1491, Revelations of America Before Columbus, in which he takes world historians to task for failing to do full justice to the richness and detail of pre-1492 American history, or that is the time before the Spaniards arrived and began their colonization of the Americas, and the Portuguese as well. Now, these societies had no effective contact with other parts of the world, although this isolation did not hamper their development before or during the post-classical period. It did create vulnerabilities once contact was established. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the reasons why these vulnerabilities occurred. Now, American societies lacked certain technologies, such as the use of metal or weaponry or tools, and the use of wheels on devices other than toys. The Americans also lacked a rich mix of animals that were candidates for domestication. Now, because they had no routine contact with other parts of the world, peoples in the Americas were also vulnerable to diseases that had been acclimatized in Afro-Eurasia, notably smallpox and the measles. Now, once contact was established, American societies would suffer dreadfully. Now, the divide between the Americas before contact and the Americas after contact is crucial. Given the vulnerabilities of the Americas in technology, animal domestication, and disease immunity, developments there would be superseded by European and African patterns. Now, the Americas may have had occasional contacts from other civilizations, but these contacts were not sufficient to counteract this region's isolation from the world network. Now, the Americas offer some comparisons with other early civilizations. Some scholars have noted a vague similarity between the Inca Empire, with its emphasis on a divine ruler, and ancient Egypt, with their pharaoh. And this can be contrasted with a slightly more Mesopotamian civilization, such as Central America. Now, although American society was overwhelmed after 1492, it was not obliterated. Now, important traces of earlier artistic impulses, polytheistic religion, and aspects of local village organization and agricultural practices would survive, particularly in Central America and the Andes. Now, it's important to recognize that the legacy here was limited. Now, the problem of integrating the American patterns of the post-classical period with larger patterns remains considerable. So that's our look at the Americas. Now, in contrast, Africa fits quite well into the larger patterns of the post-classical period, including its involvement with the world network. So whereas in the Americas, the connections between the Americas and outside was very limited, in fact, non-existent in some aspects, this contact with the other world, with the world network, was more prominent in Africa. Now, agriculture and ironworking were introduced early in Africa, and the spread of these developments, south of the Sahara, proceeded relatively steadily before and during the post-classical period. In a process known as the Great Bantu Migrations, peoples originally located in West Central Africa moved southward and eastward, bringing with them agriculture, ironworking, and new kinds of political organization. Now, the spread of the Bantus was a major development in terms of connections among African language groups. Now, early civilization activities in sub-Saharan Africa focused in the Upper Nile area in some connection to developments in Egypt. Significant states and cultures developed in Kush and Aksum, followed by the establishment of an Ethiopian state. Now, these activities took place in connection with patterns in the Middle East and the Eastern Mediterranean, which is one reason that Ethiopia received early influences from Judaism and even Christianity. Now, in the post-classical period itself, two centers of activity developed in Africa. The Swahili Belt stretched along the Indian Ocean coast in mixed Arab-African communities. The region encompassed an active set of trading societies and developed a written language and political organization of the city-state type. So we have city-states on the Swahili Belt. Now, larger kingdoms featuring powerful rulers emerged in sub-Saharan West Africa. Sometimes called Sudanic, after the Arab word for black, these kingdoms experienced increasing trade activity, including activity that would connect West Africa across the Sahara to North Africa and the Middle East. Now, in fitting sub-Saharan African patterns into the larger network of world history, we need to explore a few issues. Now, it's possible to suggest a few characteristic African themes, particularly in the Sudanic kingdoms of West Africa. Now, these civilizations were vigorously polytheistic and used polytheism to emphasize the close connections between human activities and the forces and features of nature. Now, these civilizations tended to emphasize the divinity of major rulers, and these civilizations focused on extended families and the connections between individuals in this life and ancestors. Now, these fairly general features can be used to provide at least some baseline for discussions of African characteristics that cut across the states of even larger regions. Now, there is a complicated relationship between African developments before and during the post-classical period and the great religious and philosophical systems that developed elsewhere. Now, African development featured the manipulation of great traditions, particularly those derived from Islam and Christianity. Now, in both the Sudanic kingdoms and the Swahili Belt, African developments were powerfully influenced by Islam. Now, outside the Swahili Belt, however, Islam did not, at this early point, become a mass religion. Now, sub-Saharan African history in the post-classical period should be viewed in much the same framework that can be used to identify the civilizations of Japan, Russia, Southeast Asia, and Western Europe. Now, most sub-Saharan Africa is another civilization, or sub-Saharan Africa, is another civilization in active contact with the most prosperous centers of the world, benefiting from trade with these centers and imitating some of their features, but also maintaining a separate sphere of influence. Now, one African historian has proposed a close comparison between developments in sub-Saharan Africa during the post-classical period and those in Western Europe, using a rough date of about 1250 CE. Now, he argues that the similarities in the societies are quite striking. Both civilizations contain significant kingdoms, larger in Africa and loosely organized. Although Africa did not develop literal feudalism, its rule had some overtones of the jockeying necessary in European feudal monarchies. And both civilizations developed new commercial centers and saw increased activity linking commerce to the Mediterranean and even the Middle East. Now, in both civilizations, both medieval Europe and post-classical Africa, merchant activities were important not only in their own right, but also in stimulating other economic developments and political activity. Now, if one looks at the same two societies 200 years later, however, the comparative situation changes markedly. European societies, particularly Spain and Portugal, were actively engaged in exploratory trips down the African coast and were experiencing rapid changes in political and even cultural systems. Now, African kingdoms did not exhibit the same kind of outreach and commitment to major change as Western Europe, largely because they did not face the same need for outreach as Western Europe. Now, the year 1450, which we'll be talking about in the next lecture, finds the fate of these two societies beginning to finally diverge.